Alright, today we're going to be looking at a series of the Gerber Mark II knives, first retailed as the Gerber Mark II combat knife and then later as the Mark II survival knife. Now obviously you can find the dates of these knives very easily by looking at the blade and finding the production number. There's plenty of information online on those, on the different dates of how many were produced each year and so forth. But what I wanted to show here today was maybe if you're looking at an estate sale or estate auction, you may see one of these knives and they may not show the production number, and you'd like to know, well, how early it is in the production run, you know, what kind of value it might have and so forth. So just thought it would show on these ones here some of the differences from year to year. Some are very minor, some may be more significant. So you know, if you're familiar with these knives, the first ones were produced in 1967, and this first one that we will look at here is a 1967. So when we look at this one here, we can look at a few of the details, just looking at the sheath first. Now some of these sheaths have sharpening stones with them and some don't. I don't know. It kind of seems like the ones with the sharpening stones are a little bit rarer, just the way it seems from what I've found. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know how many number of the run were with the sharpening stones and how many were not, but we see that the sheath here was put together with staples. In 1967, I believe, it's the only year, the first year of production, that they were put together with staples. And when we look at the, as I said, here's, you know, the easiest way. If you can see this, you can immediately find out what year it was produced. We see that this one 003058, so very early in the run. And on the other side just says Gerber, Portland, Oregon, USA. And it's actually maybe hard to tell, but you can see that the blade is not quite straight. I believe it's a 5-degree angle, that some of these ones from 1967, the early ones, were produced that way. So when we look at this next one here, this is one from 1968, so the following year, and we see now that the sheath, no longer using those staples to put the sheath together, but actually using like rivets. And then we see that, once again, serial number, this one's 5856, 1968. But when we look at the blade is no longer has the 5-degree angle to it. And then we look at this next one here. This is another 1968. So not much in the way of changes, but one thing I thought was odd was there's no rivets on here for this sheath. And it's the only one I've seen quite like that. I don't know why. It is an official Gerber sheath. I have seen some of these sheaths that don't say Gerber up here. I guess they were just aftermarket ones, but this one does seem to be an official Gerber. And besides that, it's mainly stays the same as the previous one that was from 68. Now this next one, even though it's still in that 1968 production run, we see one significant change is switching from, this was the cat's tongue, and this they considered the armor hide. And the armor hide's kind of what they continued to use on the knives for quite a few years. So it was just a change in the production run during some point in 1968. And when you see them next to each other, you can see a difference in the color that's pretty easy to spot. And let's see if there's any other changes right off. I don't think there really was. That was the only one. So this next one here, we're moving on to 1969. And in 1969, one of the changes on the sheath, we look at the 68 one, it just says Gerber, Portland, Oregon, USA. And in 1969, we see that it's got 3 lines now. It says Gerber, Portland, Oregon, has a zip code, and USA. So that occurred some point in 1969. And we see they're continuing on using the armor hide rather than the cat's tongue. And one thing I thought was interesting, maybe if you're a knife collector you may know why this is, but this one, the production number is different from all these other ones. They've all got a certain like font to them, and this one's just a little bit different. And it's not even quite on there straight. It seems to be at a minor angle. And I don't know why that is. If you happen to know, I would love to find out about it if you'll just comment in the comments below. So that one was from '69. Now we're moving on to 1970. Again, not a lot of significant changes, but 1970 was the last year that Gerber marketed this knife as the combat knife. In '71 they started saying it was a survival knife. Again, mainly not much in the way of changes, still continuing with the 3 lines here with the zip code on the sheath. Got the sharpening stone and the production number there. So that one, 1970. This one here is also a 1970. And I don't think it has, there's only, 1,500 knives between these two, so not really a lot as far as changes in the knife or the sheath. It's mainly just the same. This one here we see jumping ahead a few years. We went from 1970, now we're in 1974, I believe. And one of the significant changes we see is that all the previous ones had this narrow wasp. When we look at the 1970 and we compare it to the 1974, this would be considered a wide wasp compared to a narrow wasp. So that was one of the significant changes. We also see, it's kind of hard to tell, but if you look at the, whether you would call this a knife or a sword that's in the stone, when we look at the earlier ones, a little bit of difference on the handle and the width of the knife or sword. We also see down below here where this says Portland, Oregon, USA. On these earlier ones, there is a comma after Portland, and comma or period after the abbreviation for Oregon. So just minor changes on that, but the main change, as we see through the years, of having the wide wasp. And then one change on the sheath. As we look at the earlier ones, this is more of a rounded tip here, and they started doing these more sharp point to the sheath. So that one was in 1974. Well, in 1977 they started to make what I think was one of the more significant changes, and we see it on this one here, which is actually a 1979. Right away you see the handle switching from this gray to the black, and then even on the sheath we see switching from a brown to a black. So pretty significant. That happened in 1977, somewhere in that run. And then when we look, it's mainly not a lot of difference. I mean, you can see that the teeth on it are certainly, these were fine teeth. That's a little bit more coarse. And we see, even just looking at, again, the 2 knives or swords. This one here is just a little bit less on detail than this one. So that is 1979. So certainly if you see a photo one, you see one that's black, oh, that's 1977 or newer, unless it was one of the commemorative ones. If you see one that's a brown sheath, gray handle, at the newest it should be 77, unless it's a commemorative one. Now this last one here is one that can be easily confused for being a Gerber Mark II, but it's actually not. This is the Gerber Command II. And when we see these two next to each other, the sheaths are a little bit different. Very, very minor somewhat. I mean, certainly down here at the bottom, rather than having the way that the Mark II has been. This one's just a little bit more squared off on the end. And then when we look at the actual knives, you know, you look at the handles, not a big difference. One of the bigger differences I saw was like when you see it, the edge. You know, obviously the Command II are much thicker on that end. And then we also see down here, just these last few inches is all that has the teeth, versus the way that the Mark IIs had been putting the teeth further down the blade and putting it on both sides. So you see one that has teeth just down here at the end of the blade on one side, you know, pretty thick edge. You know, you're looking at a Command II versus a Mark II. And then when we flip it over and look, you know, looking at the Gerber, not a lot of change on that from the Mark II. But one thing they started doing, I'm guessing that this one's probably from like 1982, because I believe 1982 is when they started with the production number, starting to put an alpha numeric number to start with. So that one being an A, I believe that would be 1982. So there you have it. Series of Command Mark II to Command II, ranging from 1967 all the way up to the last Gerber II, one that was on the table here being a 1979, and the Command II being a 1982. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you're a knife expert, you probably knew all of this, and you probably got a lot more details on how you can tell them apart. If you do, go ahead and comment below. I'd love to hear about more details about how do you tell different years apart. As always, I appreciate you watching. If you've enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate if you would go ahead and subscribe and like the video. Thanks.